Today we're talking to James from Canuck Timepieces. And James and I have connected quite recently over the past, I think, month or few weeks or so. And I've had the pleasure of borrowing and sort of experiencing the fourth dimension, which is on my wrist right now from James. It's on pre-order right now, which you call
It's on pre-order.
it's
Yeah.
release. Yeah.
No,
Pre-order of
pre-order. Yeah.
yeah, pre-order release of your most recent watch. So, really interested to talk to you about it and you more broadly as a designer and your influences, especially in the watch space and with the rest of the community. So, I mean, first of all, hello. Do you want to share
Hello, Sean. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Do you want to share what's on your wrist?
So I won't fully show it. It's here. I can show it that way. It's so it is my case prototype for my signature release that will be revealed in late August and then released in the end of September at the Toronto Timepiece Show. So it's my first signature, just me, no collaboration. That doesn't mean that collaboration ends, by the way. It's just I wanted to create something that allowed me to have a consistent product moving forward, if that makes sense.
Yes. And I think one of the interesting things we talked about briefly before in our private conversations would be keen to discuss that transition of how the focus and the language around your own pieces, your solo pieces going forward. But before we get to where we are now between the fourth dimension and I guess the fifth dimension, let's I guess go back in time and kind of talk about where the bug I guess started for you, where that sort of doesn't have to be exact, but where that transitionary period where you really got interested in watches as a designer, as wanting to do something more.
Yeah, so I have a non-traditional background of how I became a designer. I don't even like calling myself that, but people in the industry are like, no, you're a designer now. I'm like, okay. So I grew up, in the 90s. So in the 90s, we didn't have cell phones. Just wasn't a thing. Or sorry, there was. They were just ginormous and people didn't have them. And kid growing up, I remember having little cheap Timexes that I would wear. But my first watch that I remember actually having and wearing on wrist often was the Nike Tri-X or some version of it. It was the Nike Sport watch that was the Y2K look. Probably was around between 99 and 2001 probably when I got it. I just remember that was the first visual piece that I saw and I'm like, that's wild. It's so cool. And my dad, he works in the financial industry. So I was always surrounded by watches, more of the typical, luxury timepiece side of things where it was okay, you have Omega, you have Breitling, you have Tag. Ironically enough, though, the first one that caught my eye was the Hamilton Ventura. Because again, so unique. As a teenager, seeing this watch from Men in Black, right? So that's what it was from, I think, originally. Something very unique in its design that I don't think of when you think of a watch or you think of a clock. The Ventura's out there and in the best way, as you can see from our designs. I like having something unique within that. So that was kind of the inspiration of always being surrounded by watches. Now through high school, it started to be more of fashion and sneakers that I gravitated towards, probably because, high school experience, that's what I gravitated towards. But I always cared about, design in general, right? Like a sneaker or fashion design. And at one point, I actually wanted to go to, it's not called Ryerson anymore. It's Toronto Metropolitan. And I wanted to go to the business school to do not fashion design, but fashion marketing. And I didn't end up going that route. But, as I continued to go, into college, that's when I stopped wearing watches kind of, because again, we kind of hit that smartphone where I'm like, why do I need a watch? And because I'll be honest, for me, it was I didn't have a lot of money. So I'm like, well, I don't even care about not even sneakers at that point because I'm like, well, I'm wearing Vans. That's what I wore, Vans and Chucks, because I'm like, that's what I could afford. It looks good. It goes with outfits, and you know, got married young, so through that we're kind of building our life, and then you know, by the time I was right before 30, turned 37 this year, I started to have a little bit more money to spend. So I started looking back into sneakers and fashion and then watches. They all stem from, I think, a love of design that I didn't grow up in an artistic house, but I am fairly artistic in what I enjoy. Like I love art, like just in
Yeah.
general, painting, sculpture, buildings. And I think that I started to cater, or I guess dial into that more as my wife and I like to travel different cities we would go to. I'd start to like try and understand the architecture and why that architecture the way it is, just like I did with fashion or sneakers. The love of watches came back into play when we were on a cruise ship. It's 2021, I think. 2022 is like, I'm trying to think.
Yeah.
And I realized if anyone's ever been on a cruise, you'll know that you don't have cell reception and you have to pay for Wi-Fi, or it's bad quality, or it's really expensive. So I just don't use it. Airplane mode.
Yeah.
But I didn't have a watch. So I pull up my cell phone to check the time. Well, every time I checked the time, I would unlock my phone and open an app that I couldn't use.
Yeah.
And I realized at that point, I'm like, this is bad. This is bad. So it almost like watches came back in because I was like, no, technology's taking
Yeah.
and I need something analog. Ironically enough, my first watch was Casio A158 when I came back into it.
When you talk about the journey of watches, it's interesting too, because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. It doesn't seem, in a good way, it doesn't seem like there's a indoctrination, so to speak, that oriented you towards a certain design, because you talked about when you were younger and your father had all these watches and you gravitate towards the Ventura. So it's kind of interesting too, if you think about people in the community, a lot of people get into watches and like certain designs, particularly when they're older, when they have, disposable income to perhaps buy particular watches. And they're so conditioned, so to speak, by, the mass market or advertisement or whatnot. And, that really, most of the time, that's limits or chokes desire around things that look like a traditional, like Submariner or Seamaster or something like that. So it's kind of cool that when, as being younger as a teenager or a child or whatnot, when that isn't there in your mind, can just kind of wonder that is the Ventura that is the one that is, interests you. Whereas like a Ventura now, I mean, I could probably confidently say it's like not a massively popular like mainstream.
I think it's a good looking watch though. Like I still look at it and I go, that's cool. And like you said, I think it's like taking that chance, which, we've discussed separately, but like, coming into like watches where I was like, okay, watched all the content creators, right? I guess the big ones at the time, I guess would have been 4 or 5 years ago, where it was like Teddy. Teddy was like the main guy, right? Teddy still is. Everything kept coming back to, hey, if you've never worn a watch, don't waste money. You're on your first watch. Spend like something so you like it. And I've said this, and people who have spoken to me know that I think the best watch of all time, if you take bias out of it, it really is the Casio A158 or the F91W or anything of that, because I look at it as like it hasn't changed in price. It's recognizable by people who are wealthy or don't have money, and they wear them. Doesn't matter what end of the socioeconomic, scale that you're on, you still will wear a Casio, specifically that type of Casio. So it hasn't changed in price. They haven't changed the technology. They haven't changed the design yet. It still sells in the probably hundreds of thousands a year, if not more. They don't have to have like, there are fakes of it, of course, but why? Doesn't make sense, like, spend $25 versus 15. But by going to that next step, again, less of a typical step for watches, right? You start looking at, like, Seiko 5s or whatever. I did, but vintage watches, Soviet era of watches were what I started to fall in love with watches, like, again, like, fully.
So you mentioned Soviet watches, and I think that's something that's very much niche that a lot, like a large majority of collectors will know about. But I'm surprised they used to be more popular. I feel for and I don't really hear about them as much anymore, which is really interesting and cool because Soviet watches, especially like all the way up to even more recently neo vintage, they had a very different aesthetic. Yeah, a very different like cultural design aesthetic that you just wouldn't expect to see in the West. So tell me about that. Like what's, what did you see or what kind of drew you to it?
To be honest, it had to do with price point initially because I was looking at vintage watches and I'm like, okay, vintage like Seiko and Citizen. I'm like, okay, well, I don't want quartz. Funny enough, that's 1970s quartz era is like my favorite design set, actually. But when I was like, I want mechanical. I want to try mechanical, but I want like something with history. I remember seeing the Raketa Copernic or Copernicus, if you want to translate it. That watch to me was, again, being kind of new again into watches. I say new because I only knew the typical brands before this. And it was this like, whoa, what is that? What do you mean circular hands? That is wild. And then I started backtracking further from like the like 70s, 80s when that released and then going, wait, I can buy a Soviet era, like 1950s, 1960s style watch for is that $80, right? It's like, and then I find out obviously there's like Frankensteins and whatever, but to me, it didn't matter. It was the aesthetic, and it's like, okay, cool. So it still has the original movement. That's cool. Hands replaced, whatever. But then the dials, like seeing that they're worn and it's just like okay that's been through something seeing even the growth within that industry like they just stuck to mechanical they had quartz and they had digital I understand that but they were still selling they still sell the original Vosta amphibia with that movement it's the same movement. Just knowing that there's a story behind it and why they exist in the first place because of Swiss watchmaking and American watchmaking. They decided, and I'm sure you know a little bit of the story where it's like they take, the old. I'm pretty sure it was like in Switzerland. They were getting rid of machinery, and the Soviets were like, "Oh, we'll take it." And I'm like, "That's just wild. That's wild that they decided to make their own market based on machinery that was used by everyone else in the watch industry at the time."
I mean, it makes sense too because that period timekeeping would have been important, would have been, actual tour, daily instrument. I assume it's kind of you afford or you buy like the best tech you can afford at the time and just start making it kind of becomes, part of the, I guess, industry or ecosystem, at least for Soviet watches. So yeah, there's some really distinct stuff. And I think the same too with China and even I mean I don't know I'm not going to be able to recall off the top of my head if it was intentional, but for Zaratsu finishing, the Japanese bought German Solatz machines, and Zaratsu is just a Japanese phonetic pronunciation of that, and became like wholly their thing. It's really interesting that journey. You mentioned too, like you like 70s quartz watches in particular. So are you thinking about that 70s Seiko where they have kind of the fractured crystals?
Yeah, the shaped crystals, like, it's actually not that, it's actually the bracelet watches, like, so Piaget and then Seiko and also have their versions, with the Creedor, but then, you had the early quartz era, which was, like, early '70s, where you had, Crystron, which was Citizens, then Timex had the electric, and to me, it was such a unique thing, especially looking back then versus now and what is expensive and what isn't. Quartz era watches were the high quality watches from that era, and they were the expensive watches. It's just wild how that's switched back.
I think it was a transition period because I feel at that time it was still you're buying the tech. It was quartz was more accurate than anything else. So I mean, ideally before they started mastering production, it was it was the most accurate watch you can get. And to have the best, highest technology, you wrap it in like the best looking or the most avant-garde aesthetic of the time. And someone asked me recently in a comment. I mean, it's not as like simple and sort of binary or whatever, whether movement informs design or design informs the movements. This is like a pretty good segue too to go into your own design because we've looked at some of the influences that got you into the watch community or the watch hobby and yourself in whatever you want to call it, designing or kind of bringing together this aesthetic or idea that you have in the head into something that's actually physically wearable like this fourth dimension in the world. From conception to idea and thing on wrist. Like, how does this go for you?
Yeah, like the transition had kind of started because I don't know. Well, of course, algorithms change. So even though I come from sneaker streetwear kind of background from a social media perspective, you know, I still remember it was Brew watches. So Brew, very well known now. Again, vintage aesthetic. And I am not like the biggest chronograph fan. I like the design of a chronograph, but I realized after I had a Q Timex, like one of the reissues that, again, beautiful watch, but I had it on my wrist and there was just something I didn't like. Nothing was moving, like truly moving. I don't know why. I never wore it, but I saw that and I'm like, yeah, that's cool. I've never seen something like that. It kind of like introduced me to micro brands where like, discovered Vario, which is Singapore based, where they have like their vintage, also vintage inspired watches, like trench watches. And at that point, I'm like, okay, well, I'm on AliExpress, honestly, where I'm grabbing, straps and whatnot from because they were just affordable and I didn't want to spend a lot of money on it. But then I see that they're like cases and movements and hands, and I'm like, wait, I can make my own watch? I didn't know this was an option. And I'm looking at the price at the time and I'm like, yeah, if I break something, it's not the end of the world. It's not like I spent 600, 700, $800 on a watch and it breaks. I spent less than $100 Canadian at the time and I can give it a try. Why not? So I chose, something that it was actually, I don't, not put together anymore. It's been used for other prototypes. It was almost like Seamaster hands, but it had like a swirl dial that wasn't something like an homage of. And then I used like a traditional like Explorer type case because it was cheap. And I put it together. I put it on social media, like on my account that has like no watches really. And I started gaining people that were watch enthusiasts from across the world. Like, oh, nice watch type of thing. From that point forward, I had the bug where I was like, okay, I'm going to create something different. I'm going to try something this. I'm going to try this. I'm going to try this. And, the design aesthetic, unfortunately, due to limitations of AliExpress and modders and things like that, I didn't want to do homages. I didn't. To those who do homages, it's not a knock on them. You're providing a market for that. But I was pushed by a friend in Singapore to start a watch brand. And I'm like, no, no, no. I just do it for fun. Like I just make watches for fun. And after a year of him bugging, I decided to do some customs. But again, it was kind of short lived because I wasn't always doing something that I sounds like a little selfish, but I'm like, it wasn't something that I wanted to make every time. The customer is happy, but I wasn't always happy. And if it was for fun and like, why am I doing this if it's not making me happy? I started looking into what it costs to make my own hands, not cases or anything. I started with hands because it was something that I feel, you know, even with micro brands or brands that are trying something unique, a lot of times there's only so much you can do with hands. But I'm like, there's got to be something else. Like I've got to be able to create something that is unique from an aesthetic perspective. I did the Unity in Art series as the first watch of like Canuck Timepieces as like a brand. And behind the entire idea was that it was April of last year. It's when tariffs came into play. But I'm like, I have a lot of American friends. I want to do something that, like, hey, we're cool type of thing, right? And Canuck and being Canadian to me is collaboration with others, getting along with other countries, getting along with other people. When I decided from that end to grab and call it the Unity, I found a dial maker that makes certified dials, as an example. I found this dial maker on Etsy like 2 years prior that I had saved. That's what's crazy about it. And when I reached out, I said, "Hey, I'm starting a brand, but I kind of want to start with 5 pieces, and I'm a big fan of your dials, like you do Fordite, but I really like the Surfite. Again, limited to hands. I used a handset that was traditional, but at the same time, that wasn't the point. It was the dial that was the focus. Honestly, it was a failure. First 2 months, I sold 2 watches in 2 months. But in that time, I never stopped making watches for myself. And in comes Ando. I've been following AndoAndoAndo for probably a year and a half at that point. My personal account. Ando originally had just been doing modern cases. Now he has the vinyl, which has been very popular for him. So, I bugged him. To be honest, I did bug him once a month. There was a case that he kept sharing in his story, but it was never releasing. So I just, hey, if you're ever releasing that, or if you're never, like, I'd love to buy a piece off of you to make something for myself. Well, that became the Black Hole, which was our first release. Cool story, because once I got it, I knew what I wanted to make. I knew I wanted Masu Black. I knew I wanted Ming-esque hands, limited to being only what was out there. I used a Ming hand, like a Ming-esque handset, but I had a yellow seconds hand, which again, I work with what I got, right? And I posted it at like 9 o'clock at night, woke up the next morning on my personal page, which had like 10 likes on every post for watches, like not big at all. I wake up with over 100 likes, comments, DMs, and one of the DMs was from Ando. Said, "Do you want to make this?" I said, like, sure, let's do it. But I started a brand called Canuck. He's like, "Oh yeah, yeah." So like we ended up, deciding to make this, but I'm like, he's like, "Well, how many do you want to make? 30, 40, 50?" I'm like, "How about 10?" Because I had only sold 2 watches at that point in 2 months. And he's like, "Well, we can't use those hands. Do you have any ideas?" And I'm like, "Do I have any idea? Of course I have ideas." That's when, you know, I give Ando a lot of the credit for allowing me to enter the industry that I'm in now, because it was the first opportunity that I got to like make something, the hands specifically, that were mine, right? That were something that I could show. Now, again, this was a science fiction esque, design. I love sci-fi. I love movies in general, but I love science fiction. There was something that I was able to almost like, it sounds so corny. It was like a blank palette that I could just like, oh, I can do something that it's been in my mind for forever, but I can't draw. I can't use CAD. How am I supposed to do this? I realize I'm able to create something without those skills. And I can thank technology for that, ironic. And that obviously led to, the series that, Black Hole, inspired by Interstellar. So I wanted to do Black Hole and then the Wormhole, which I do have beside me, of course, which was part two of the series. And if you look, there was a seconds hand disc that for me was something special from a design perspective, because it, even though it does not look vintage at all, it's inspired by a mystery dial. Because again, 1970s, I think they took a lot of chances with design, and I wanted to do that.
It was a good time. Everyone was on acid.
Yes, and so when I came up with this, and I'm like, it's still gonna be Masu Black, but I can figure out something, with the bezel where it's actually like a Java language from, it's outer rim basic from the Star Wars universe, which is kind of funny because I couldn't actually say Star Wars. I couldn't actually say Interstellar, right? What I could do was have hits of it and something that wasn't owned by various companies. And when that released, it sold out in about 4 weeks, 30 pieces. And at the time, again, that was really exciting. It's still exciting for me to sell pieces, but it was the first time that like it gained momentum a little bit where people started to go, "Oh, who's that?" And then other brands had started to like notice who I was a little bit, which that's a big part of Canuck is that when I talk about collaboration and I talk about genuine connection, like I support other brands. I love supporting other brands that make unique pieces as well. In an industry where there's a lot of copy and paste, I love when a fellow brand is trying something different and unique. So like it's just part of that where I said Brew is an inspiration, Vario was an inspiration. Well, Lima was also an inspiration out of Indonesia, which I am very fortunate enough that I had a, a recent collaboration with them where Herman and I had been speaking for about a year at that point. Just, like, as I started following on personal, we ended up releasing 20 pieces and very fortunate. It sold out in 72 hours. So I was and they're officially delivered as of today. All of them are delivered except for one, which I'm delivering to someone locally. Again, it was like all of mine have been pre-orders, right? Like I don't come from true wealth where I have a family, I've got kids, I've got the things I need to take care of, and I don't have 75, $100,000 to front a cost for something that may sell or may not. It's an industry that's driven by that. And by the way, no disrespect to people who have that. That's actually extremely impressive and extremely impressive that you have so much faith and be able to do that. So I think it made me work 2 to 3 times harder to figure out how to create something special while also making sure I don't put my family into debt.
When you talk about the community, those microbrands that you sort of caught your radar and that you're able to, collaborate with, do you think there's sort of an appetite for more and more stuff like that? And also, like, how does that inform or influence, your own designs going forward in your solo launches and what you kind of want to do in a brand that's just wholly Canuck timepieces?
Good question. So again, I noted that I come from a social media side, like where there's sneakers, fashion, streetwear, right? Well, I think we're in a similar spot to what sneakers and streetwear were in between 2016 and 2022, where there was so many limited, so much hype. The media just took it and ran. Everything at a resale value. I don't think we're in the resale value for micro brands, but we're in the boom where there's like a new micro brand every day. For me, I think that's like a good thing as a whole, but for like where the industry is going, I think the boom is like it will slow down. But I think for myself and how I look at design, there's a reason why my watches are kind of weird, kind of unique in the sense I know they're not for everybody, and that's okay. I think that allows myself and others who do something similar to have longevity within the space where you're going to have enthusiasts that want something special and unique that they can have for a long time, but also have something that's unique in their collection and that doesn't look like a Submariner, doesn't look like, a typical dress watch. The creativity in the space over the next 12 to 18 months, I think you're going to see a ton of creativity. Like technology has come so far. Chinese watchmaking has come so far. And I think it's a good thing because I think it's challenging the larger companies, but it's also challenging existing micro brands to like do something special and do something unique, not just for enthusiasts, but just for the industry as a whole, where it's like, hey, let's move forward. We get it. This is a very niche space, but let's create something special. Let's create something unique so that this era is maybe compared to the 1970s era of watches or the 1950s where it started to like just post war, right? Like there's so much that you can take from it. So like that's how I see it. And for me moving forward, what makes Canuck to me is a handset and soon to be a case. There will be some, I will say, the style moving forward will be future retro. So you have something that pulls from the past, but also something that could be in the future. So like Back to the Future as an example, or Fallout style, where it's like, oh, it's retro future or future retro or whatever we want to call it.
Back to the past. Back to the future. Well, Back to the Future.
Back to the Future, right? Like when they travel forward, we all know, right? Like it's like he came up and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, hoverboards, but everything looked the same. It still looked old with weird futuristic Jetson style type look to it at the same time.
That's interesting too, because that's kind of a whole discussion or essay in itself, that you have all these decades that have a perception of what the future is. I mean, months ago I did a video on Art Deco, but they're so distinct designs and aesthetic of the period on how that generation or that sort of that cultural zeitgeist at that time like perceives what a future looks like. Whereas in Art Deco, it's all. I mean, essentially, it's encapsulating the movie Metropolis, what they think the future looks like. But when you have when you fast forward to Back to the Future, it's kind of like that googly boogie, or it's like the Memphis design movement using a lot of primary shapes like triangles and squares and circles and primary colors and combining them together. But that was very much a very 90s, especially like aesthetic, 80s, 90s aesthetic. But you'll see in Back to the Future, when you go to the future, like they see kind of quirky things like hoverboards, pizzas that can be rehydrated into like massive pizzas, whereas, again, compared to Art Deco, how they saw it was this very industrial, classy aesthetic of machine metal future. I can see that, Back to the Future. But your current watch that is available for pre-order is the Fourth Dimension, which is I'm borrowing right now, which is on my wrist, which I'll be doing a short kind of design dive video that I'll be releasing on Sunday on both my channel, Watch Design Co. on Instagram and TikTok. But is there anything else that we should be on the lookout for? I know like you said, you have a prototype on your wrist that you're working on, and going forward, you're going to be focusing. You'll still be doing collaborations, but you're working too on your solo launch, and you're currently going through that process. Anything else that you think is interesting, or that listeners, viewers should kind of keep their eye on the horizon?
Yeah, like as you said, like with the Fourth Dimension, that watch is just showing what you're able to do without modification of a movement. How about that? Where you can utilize something that the brand identity of like what I like how I think of when I design is affordability, I want to be accessibility, and I want serviceability. So the affordability, it should be affordable. And even though it's unique, it should be affordable. But accessibility, yes, I understand you're limited, but it's not like you can't access it, right? And then lastly, it's that serviceability, right? Because you can have the first two. That's usually not an issue, but having the serviceability in an affordable watch, but also pushing boundaries of how something looks. I want someone 5, 10 years down the road that has a Canuck. If something happens or they want to service it or whichever, they can take it to any watchmaker and it can be serviced or fixed or replace the movement. Because I think that in the affordable space, we think about like, oh, you can modify movement, it's still affordable, and it's like, yeah, but if it breaks, it's going to cost the same amount to ship it to someone, get it fixed as you would in a lot of cases. So if it's over $1,000, I get it. Now, on the horizon, yes, I have my signature release in September. It'll be revealed in August. In early August, there will be a limited run. There's another collaboration of 15 pieces with, I can't say right now who it is, but
You can say the continent. I'm kidding.
well, yeah, it's an American-based watch club. Like again, it's kind of like this. Okay, I have the Fourth Dimension, but I don't want to get rid of the small limited pieces because I think like I said, the core of the brand. I want to make sure that, artists or, you know, other brands or anyone that wants to work together, I want to be open to it because I think it's, again, sounds corny, but working together helps the world get better type of thing, right? Like I think it's something special, and especially working with small artists or small brands that have something to offer, and maybe some people don't know who they are. And I think it's important moving forward.
Okay. If people want to follow you or check out more of your stuff, where should they go look?
Yeah. So I'm only on Instagram, not on TikTok, but it's Canuck Timepieces. So at Canuck Timepieces or CanuckTimepieces.com. If you're looking to pre order the fourth dimension, they will be in my hand by the end of August. So hopefully, end of August, early September delivery.
Okay, cool. And for myself, for now, this is Watch Design Co. I'm on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. I do 3 videos a week, so I can be found there. And thanks everyone for joining and listening.